These 3 mistakes literally cost me over $5 million when I was starting my freight broker business. So if you're a freight broker or a freight agent, or you're looking to become a freight broker or freight agent, stop, listen, and lean in, because you're definitely not going to want to miss this. Now, the fact is, all of these mistakes were very avoidable. Had I seen this video before I started my freight broker business, I would have literally saved over $5 million. And what you have to understand is this: it's okay to make mistakes. It's totally normal to make mistakes, particularly as a new entrepreneur or as a startup. Mistakes happen. We have to learn from those mistakes. I fortunately learned from those mistakes. If I hadn't learned from those mistakes, I probably would have lost 20 million. But I did learn from those mistakes along the way, and so can you. And that's the reason why I'm sharing this with you today, because I want you to learn from my mistakes. I'm more than willing to be open and transparent and admit where I've made some big mistakes. And so, yeah, if you're looking to grow a successful freight brokerage, or you're looking to start a freight broker or freight agent program, you definitely want to lean in, because these are things that can save you a ton of time, a ton of frustration, and a ton of money. So here are my notes. Let's jump into these really, really quick. And these are not going to be intuitive. These are things that you may not think of, and very few people talk about as it relates to their freight broker startup journey. Okay, cool. Number 1 is hiring the wrong people. Every entrepreneur in every industry that's ever hired anybody understands how difficult it can be to hire the right people, because there are a lot of people out there raising their hand and telling you how great they are. And there's this old adage: the best actor gets the job. So it's hard to filter through who's right and wrong. You're never going to hit the bullseye 100% when it comes to hiring, okay? But hiring the wrong people into key roles like sales and, management positions, those types of hires can be very costly. There are studies out there that say if you hire, say, a mid-level manager for $60,000 or $70,000 a year, and then they turn over, the cost of replacing them is $60,000 to $70,000. So it can be very, very expensive to replace a key hire if you hire wrong. So you've got the direct replacement cost. Secondly, you've got lost productivity. Let's say, for example, you hire a salesperson and you put them on a base and some sort of commission structure. You're monitoring their growth and they're kind of up and down. And let's say it takes you 5 or 6 months to figure out they're not a good fit. Or maybe they find out that they're not a good fit and they self-select out. Either way, you let them go or they leave. Now you've got 5 months of lost productivity, and now you have to replace that person. Beyond that, you've also got the loss in morale, right? The people around them, their colleagues, their friends, the people that were hired with them, their managers, the rest of the team start seeing a lot of turnover by hiring the wrong people, and that kills morale. That'll kill your culture, right? So hiring the wrong person can be very, very expensive. And I've done all the wrong things many, many times before, right? But I can tell you that what you want to focus in on is you want to focus in on people that have proven track record of being excellent in their field. Now, it doesn't necessarily they don't necessarily have to be experienced freight brokers. They don't necessarily have to be experienced in logistics. But if you're hiring somebody into a managerial role, you want them to have significant proven experience. If you're hiring somebody into a sales role, right, and they're going to be maybe a key role in sales, you got to know what you're getting. If you're hiring somebody for front line, then they're probably not going to have a lot of experience. But if you're hiring somebody for a little bit higher end, national accounts or otherwise, you want to hire somebody who has a proven track record of success. Okay. So hiring is one of those mistakes that has cost me, I don't know, it would be hard to tabulate, but it's definitely into the 7 figures when it comes to making hiring mistakes. Okay. So that's number 1. Number 2, focusing too much on getting new customers, and not enough time on customer development and retention. The concept that it's cheaper to retain a client than it is to get a new client is 100% true. But most people, including myself, have over-optimized their business to acquire new customers and not spend enough time focusing on customer development and retention. Because ultimately, let's think about it this way. If you get a new customer and they give you a load and you move that load and you make a couple $100 on that load, you've only made a couple $100. If you don't retain that client and get the repeat business, well, then the lifetime value of that client was only a couple $100 in profit. But if you get that customer, you spend, say, days or weeks or even months trying to acquire that customer, and you spend all that time, and then you move the first load in week 1, and then in week 2, you develop that, enhance that trust in that relationship. And then in week 2, you move 4 loads. And then in month 3, you're moving 10 loads. And by month 6, you're moving 5 loads a week. So that development has now increased what we call the lifetime value of that shipper. So the real trick in this business and in most businesses is not the front end sale. Of course, you have to get that client in the door, but the real trick to the business is retention. And that requires you to be very conscious about that. So there's a couple things. I'm going to give you a couple of tips here on customer development and retention. I can't dive into that real deep right here, but ultimately I'm going to give you a couple tips. A couple tips are this, okay? Number one, one of the things that I made the mistake and we should have done more of is we should have had more face time with our clients. What do I mean by that? Whenever possible, whenever economically feasible, you want to reinvest some of those profits back into the relationship and actually visit your clients face to face. I know it's hard to believe, but most freight brokers don't do this. Most freight agents don't do this unless they're in their local market. And even then, sometimes they don't do it. But no matter where they are, your goal should be at least once a year with your book of business. You should be out there breaking bread, talking to your clients, having conversations with them, understanding what's going on inside their business face to face, not just over the phone. So you want to develop those types of relationships where you have a face to face relationship. Those types of relationships are much stronger than just email, text, and phone, right? It's just you build rapport quicker and understand it's a great way for you to differentiate yourself. So one of the keys here, again, in customer development and retention is putting a face to the name and meeting them and going and visiting them as often as economically possible. That's one of the tips. The other one is a really important one, and that is you want to develop multiple relationships within the organization. So rather than just having one point of contact that is tendering the loads and you really don't know anybody else in the organization, what you want to do is you want to try to develop relationships with people in that organization at multiple levels. You got the frontline, maybe people that are tendering the loads. You've got managers slightly above them, maybe the shipping manager or the warehouse manager, and then you got maybe a director level or VP level above them. Your goal should be to develop 3 relationships at 3 different levels within that organization. Now, why is that? Well, the fact is people turn over, right? If you've got a client that's doing $250,000 a year with you, and then you've only got one point of contact and that person gets fired or quits or passes away, all of a sudden, now your entire opportunity is up in arms and it has the potential of losing it because you lost that one relationship. And I've lost clients because of that. Most brokers who have been in business long enough will tell you the same story. But the reality is, if you have multiple layers of relationships within that organization, the ability for you to survive that event, that turnover event, for whatever reason it is exponentially higher. Okay, so that's my tip for number 2, which is focusing on new customers versus customer development and retention. Now, don't get me wrong, you have to focus on new customers, but you have to balance new customer acquisition and customer development and retention. Okay, and number 3, I saved this for last because this is by far one of the biggest mistakes that I ever made in setting up my freight brokerage, as well as other businesses that I've been involved with in the past, is taking on outside investors. Taking on outside investors is typically not needed for a freight brokerage or freight agency. Most freight brokerage can be bootstrapped. It doesn't take an enormous amount of capital in order to cash flow that business because you can either have an established credit line or even more often, you can work with factoring companies to help finance your receivables And again, if you don't know what a factoring company is, it's basically specialized financing that allows you to pay your carriers before you get paid by your shippers, okay? So it doesn't really require you to take on outside investment. And let me explain to you the downside of taking on an outside investor. Let's say you want to start a freight brokerage and you don't have a ton of money, but the reality is you've got a friend who's have been successful, or a colleague or business connection who's been successful, and you say, listen, if you invest $100,000 into my startup, I'll give you 50% of my business. This is just a hypothetical, okay? Now, today, when he's giving you that investment, that company's probably worth zero if it's a true startup. But now you exchange for 100,000, you give them 50% of your company. Now they're an outside investor. They've invested capital. They're not necessarily working inside the business. They're just a capital investor. Now imagine this. Imagine you grow that company over the next 5 or 10 or 15 years, and you grow that company to be worth $50 million a year. I'm not talking 50 million in revenue. I'm talking to be worth, as a company, $50 million. Well, what you just did was you traded $100,000 in cash at the startup for half of $50 million. And I'm not very good at math, but that's $25 million. So my suggestion to you is this: if possible, and it's almost always the case, you should bootstrap your freight brokerage or freight agency and not take on outside investors, okay? Outside investors, there's a lot of pros and cons, and I'm not going to dive into it right now. But the reality is, it will ultimately, if you are successful, that one step alone will cost you millions, if not tens of millions of dollars. Hey, thanks for sticking around all the way to the end. If you like this video, make sure you click on this video. You're going to love it. Click the thumbnail, and I'll see you on the inside.